He said he loved her in front of everybody. National TV, multiple seasons, hour-long declarations, romantic chaos, defiant stares across living room couches while two generations battled over traditions, age, and control. But what nobody saw coming, that the real fight wouldn't happen on the show. It would happen in police stations, community meetings, and behind closed doors in a neighborhood that had allegedly had enough. And some of that pressure was coming from inside the house. Jenny Slatten, the woman mocked for being old enough to be his grandma, allegedly found herself at the center of something much colder than family drama. A slow-burn campaign to make her pack her bags and leave India. Not through shouting matches or teary lectures. Through what some sources now claim was something closer to a coordinated takedown, legal complaints, whispered community support, and moves that, if true, risked pushing her out of the country entirely. What started as quirky reality TV steps, wedding ceremonies, temple visits, screaming aunties, morphed off-camera into something no TLC producer could stage. There were no cameras when the sense of threat flickered into Jenny's voice. No producers when she started wondering if her presence was unwanted inside her own marriage. And no script when she realized she might not even be safe. Because the way it unfolded wasn't like an episode. It was slow, subtle, until it wasn't. According to multiple people close to the family, the signs were barely visible before things had allegedly already begun to move behind the scenes. What looked like normal neighbor tension had another layer. Residents around Jenny and Sumit, some of whom had already voiced open disgust about their age gap, allegedly became part of a much broader rejection of this marriage altogether. To understand how surreal this gets, you have to remember the version of this relationship sold to the public. The brave American woman who stood against cultural convention. The misunderstood Indian man caught between two worlds. The in-laws fighting for tradition. It was messy. It was dramatic. But ultimately, audiences were led to believe it was kinda harmless. But behind that cheerful music and awkward spice market montages, there was real bitterness building. And in those pockets of bitterness, things reportedly began to happen off-camera. Jenny, who had always struggled with her inability to understand Hindi, mentioned multiple times she felt excluded and ignored whenever Sumit's family spoke around her. What once felt like passive aggression allegedly evolved into a sense of isolation so deep, it became dangerous. Words that were once snide turned into strategies. And for someone in a foreign country, in a house that felt less like a home and more like a trap, that shift was terrifying. The emotional abuse wasn't sudden. Jenny didn't raise her voice because someone insulted her once. It was the quiet, the lack of support, being made to feel like a burden, to feel like love had an expiration date and she was the only one who hadn't been told it passed. Now, here's the disturbing part. It wasn't a misunderstanding. According to sources who say they saw this happen in real time, not TV, this wasn't just a family falling apart. This was targeted. And Jenny, already struggling to find community, allegedly came to suspect she was being pushed out deliberately, strategically, and without oversight. You know when people start telling you you're imagining things? When accusations are framed as overreactions? That's where Jenny allegedly was. Floating between doubt and dread, realizing people she had once tried to bond with might be trying to remove her entirely from their lives, not emotionally, but legally. She wasn't being frozen out. She was allegedly being coerced out. And while all this was happening, Sumit was reportedly caught in the middle, saying the right words on camera but behind the scenes, not saying much at all. Silence can feel like betrayal too, especially when you're the only one dealing with constant whispers, legal nerves, and a house you barely feel safe in. Jenny didn't grow bitter, though, not first. At first, she tried to hold it together, tried to keep smiling in public. Tried to believe that love would win and TLC would keep writing fat reunion checks to celebrate a story that looked like a win for love over culture. But then things started to fall out of frame. People whose opinions had always been clear suddenly got quieter. Others got bolder. Jenny started noticing changes around her residency process. Interactions that felt sharp, unnecessarily formal. People showing up at the house. Authorities seemingly interested in how she lived, where she lived, with whom she lived. And this wasn't a feature of local bureaucracy. This felt curated, selected, timed. Someone was allegedly pulling strings. Someone with motive, influence, and community ties. The world outside the show, the one that reality TV never films, doesn't play fair. There are no guaranteed happy arcs. No post-production edits, no safety net, just power hierarchies and loneliness in a place where public humiliation spreads fast. People say love is worth fighting for, but what they don't say is what it takes out of you when that fight moves behind your back, and the person you love doesn't realize, or worse, refuses to acknowledge. The war has already started. Jenny allegedly began to understand this when she realized something chilling. Her fear wasn't coming from her imagination. It was coming from patterns, changes in the behavior of neighbors, shifts in tone, a growing sense that the entire world around her marriage had stopped pretending to tolerate her. And she didn't want sympathy. She didn't want to be seen as a victim. But when small humiliations tripwire into systemic coldness, that's not relationship conflict. That's social eviction. Jenny wasn't being told to leave with words. She was feeling it in the way people looked at her. Or didn't. The question is, when you're pushed into a corner that carefully, that quietly, how long do you wait before you start pushing back? And what if by the time you do, the paperwork's already been filed? He said he loved her in front of everybody. National TV. Multiple seasons. Hour-long declarations, romantic chaos, defiant stares across living room couches while two generations battled over traditions, age, and control. But what nobody saw coming? That the real fight wouldn't happen on the show. It would happen in police stations, community meetings, and behind closed doors in a neighborhood that had allegedly had enough. And some of that pressure was coming from inside the house. Jenny Slatten, the woman mocked for being old enough to be his grandma, allegedly found herself at the center of something much colder than family drama. A slow-burn campaign to make her pack her bags and leave India. Not through shouting matches or teary lectures. Through what some sources now claim was something closer to a coordinated takedown, legal complaints, whispered community support, and moves that, if true, risked pushing her out of the country entirely. What started as quirky reality TV steps, wedding ceremonies, temple visits, screaming aunties, morphed off camera into something no TLC producer could stage. There were no cameras when the sense of threat flickered into Jenny's voice. No producers when she started wondering if her presence was unwanted inside her own marriage. And no script when she realized she might not even be safe. Because the way it unfolded wasn't like an episode. It was slow, subtle, until it wasn't. According to multiple people close to the family, the signs were barely visible before things had allegedly already begun to move behind the scenes. What looked like normal neighbor tension had another layer. Residents around Jenny and Sumit, some of whom had already voiced open disgust about their age gap, allegedly became part of a much broader rejection of this marriage altogether. To understand how surreal this gets, you have to remember the version of this relationship sold to the public. The brave American woman who stood against cultural convention. The misunderstood Indian man caught between two worlds. The in-laws fighting for tradition. It was messy. It was dramatic. But ultimately, audiences were led to believe it was kinda harmless. But behind that cheerful music and awkward spice market montages, there was real bitterness building. And in those pockets of bitterness, things reportedly began to happen off camera. Jenny, who had always struggled with her inability to understand Hindi, mentioned multiple times she felt excluded and ignored whenever Sumit's family spoke around her. What once felt like passive aggression allegedly evolved into a sense of isolation so deep, it became dangerous. Words that were once snide turned into strategies. And for someone in a foreign country, in a house that felt less like a home and more like a trap, that shift was terrifying. The emotional abuse wasn't sudden. Jenny didn't raise her voice because someone insulted her once. It was the quiet, the lack of support, being made to feel like a burden, to feel like love had an expiration date and she was the only one who hadn't been told it passed. Now, here's the disturbing part. It wasn't a misunderstanding. According to sources who say they saw this happen in real time, not TV, this wasn't just a family falling apart. This was targeted. And Jenny, already struggling to find community, allegedly came to suspect she was being pushed out deliberately, strategically, and without oversight. You know when people start telling you you're imagining things? When accusations are framed as overreactions? That's where Jenny allegedly was. Floating between doubt and dread, realizing people she had once tried to bond with might be trying to remove her entirely from their lives. Not emotionally, but legally. She wasn't being frozen out. She was allegedly being coerced out. And while all this was happening, Sumit was reportedly caught in the middle, saying the right words on camera but behind the scenes. not saying much at all. Silence can feel like betrayal too, especially when you're the only one dealing with constant whispers, legal nerves, and a house you barely feel safe in. Jenny didn't grow bitter, though. Not first. At first, she tried to hold it together, tried to keep smiling in public, tried to believe that love would win and TLC would keep writing fat reunion checks to celebrate a story that looked like a win for love over culture. But then things started to fall out of frame. People whose opinions had always been clear suddenly got quieter. Others got bolder. Jenny started noticing changes around her residency process. Interactions that felt sharp, unnecessarily formal. People showing up at the house. Authorities seemingly interested in how she lived, where she lived, with whom she lived. And this wasn't a feature of local bureaucracy. This felt curated, selected, timed. Someone was allegedly pulling strings. Someone with motive, influence, and community ties. The world outside the show, the one that reality TV never films, doesn't play fair. There are no guaranteed happy arcs. No post-production edits, no safety net, just power hierarchies and loneliness in a place where public humiliation spreads fast. People say love is worth fighting for, but what they don't say is what it takes out of you when that fight moves behind your back, and the person you love doesn't realize, or worse, refuses to acknowledge. The war has already started. Jenny allegedly began to understand this when she realized something chilling. Her fear wasn't coming from her imagination. It was coming from patterns. Changes in the behavior of neighbors, shifts in tone, a growing sense that the entire world around her marriage had stopped pretending to tolerate her. And she didn't want sympathy. She didn't want to be seen as a victim. But when small humiliations tripwire into systemic coldness, that's not relationship conflict. That's social eviction. Jenny wasn't being told to leave with words. She was feeling it in the way people looked at her, or didn't. The question is, when you're pushed into a corner that carefully, that quietly, how long do you wait before you start pushing back? And what if by the time you do, the paperwork's already been filed? There's a point where embarrassment stops being personal and starts becoming collective. Where what used to be whispered jokes and disapproving glances from aunties transforms into something public and persistent and punishing. And for Sumit's parents, that's allegedly exactly what happened. Sadhna and Anil Singh weren't just upset in a "we don't support this relationship" type of way. They were, according to more than one source, being called out in their own streets, stared at in temples, pulled aside in markets, talked about in words most people save for scandal. People weren't just gossiping. They were blaming them for letting this happen, for losing control of their son, for allowing what many saw as a global embarrassment to live right in their tight-knit neighborhood. In public, they presented one face. Stoic disappointment, a few emotional outbursts, a cold glare at Jenny during those televised scenes. But off-camera, things were reportedly spiraling. Social embarrassment in a smaller community can feel like constant surveillance. Your windows aren't just glass, they're public display cases. And when your neighbors stop pretending to be polite, that's when the shame turns heavy. Sumit's parents were used to a world where family decisions were not broadcast with music and subtitles, where shame carried weight, where sons marrying women their parents approved of was non-negotiable. And their Jenny was older than Sadhna, American, living in their home, having primetime arguments with their child while thousands of people streamed in every week to leave comments like "Team Jenny" or "Drag the parents." To their neighbors, this wasn't entertainment. It was a humiliation. And when humiliation lives next door, people want action. So they allegedly took matters into their own hands. It didn't happen all at once. No announcements. No instant removals. It began, according to insiders, in doorways and tea shops during harmless conversations that weren't really so harmless. "You still haven't removed that woman," someone would ask. "You're letting the name of your house deteriorate," another might say, not dramatic, but sharp enough to cut. And those cuts don't stay shallow for very long. Before long, it wasn't just pressure. It was a plan. Allegedly, Sadhna and Anil began to have quieter conversations. Not with lawyers, not yet. With influential neighbors. With community members who had already made it clear they didn't accept the marriage and didn't see Jenny as a proper member of their society. According to multiple sources familiar with the situation, these meetings were selective. Strategic, not dramatic but deliberate. The goal? To build a case, not on television, in real life. Jenny, meanwhile, was still operating under the impression this was family drama. Hurtful, complicated, painful family drama. Yes, but fixable. Her biggest concern was emotional rejection. She didn't realize at the time how many people outside that household were allegedly being pulled into what was starting to look like a formal campaign to remove her. Some even say neighbors were allegedly encouraged to document disruptions, claims of loud disagreements, unhappiness, moments where Jenny's presence felt foreign or unstable. Nothing official, but enough to slowly create an illusion of neighborhood dislike backed by incidents that could hint at disturbance, or worse, danger. You see, in some local administrative offices, collective community concern holds weight. Multiple complaints, even if subtle or unverified, can trigger attention. And according to at least 2 individuals aware of the meetings, the goal wasn't just control. The goal was removal through pressure. Pressure applied in all the right places. Jenny's name wasn't yet on a formal order, but behind the scenes, it was reportedly being spoken in rooms she didn't even have access to, framed not just as an unwanted match, but as a person who shouldn't be there. Period. This contrast between the Western idea of romantic struggle and the cultural expectation of collective family dignity was where days got darker. Sumit thought he could balance the line forever. Play the good son and the good husband, soothe his wife on camera, then downplay the fallout at home. But this wasn't balance, it was erosion. And as one insider put it, the parents stopped hoping it would pass. They started trying to make sure it didn't last. And still, Jenny didn't leave. Still, she believed in love, and that made it worse. Because now, it wasn't just cultural backlash. It was personal insult. Her refusal to leave increased the shame, at least in the eyes of those who believed the marriage was a reckless stain on the family. That's allegedly when suggestions turned into steps. There are claims, unverified but circulating, that officials were approached with soft intel. Concerns about whether Jenny could live on her own. Suggestive comments about behavior. Even questions, raised quietly, about mental health. Phrases like not adjusting well or emotionally unstable floated around at exactly the same time as sudden check-ins by authorities began to pop up more frequently at the home. People close to Jenny say she started noticing the difference. A tone shift, a stricter formality, the kind of stiffness you feel when someone has been warned about you ahead of time. When bureaucracy starts treating you not like a resident but like a variable. She reportedly brought it up to Sumit. He allegedly told her not to worry, that it was normal, that things would settle. But what he didn't say, whether he already knew more than he let on, whether he'd overheard conversations, whether his own silence was chosen. Sumit never said, "I'm doing this to protect my parents." He didn't have to. Jenny could hear it in what he didn't say, in the fact that nobody stood up and said enough on her behalf. And this is where the tragedy shifts again, because for most people watching, this whole storyline had gone stale. The marriage happened. Case closed. But in India, in that house, the story was reportedly only heating up, because where quiet rejection hadn't worked, documentation would. Allegedly, she started to feel watched, double-checked, noticed for everything she wasn't. And when that parade of pressure didn't push her to leave, the idea reportedly surfaced to help someone else make that choice for her. And here's where this whole situation turns. Medical documentation allegedly enters the picture. There's a kind of silence that speaks louder than screaming. Jenny wasn't just hearing words she couldn't understand. She was feeling excluded, watched, shrinking into corners of rooms where the conversations bounced around her in Hindi, always just loud enough to feel personal, never clear enough to argue back. That uncomfortable in-between where you're not addressed but you're definitely being talked about. People assumed, because of her age or persona, that Jenny was weak, fragile, overdramatic at best, manipulative at worst. But there's nothing weak about a woman living thousands of miles from home, stripped of language, belonging, family, and still waking up every day trying to keep her relationship alive. What Jenny was doing required emotional stamina most people wouldn't last 2 weeks under. But when your every move begins to feel like it's being logged, when you stop knowing if an immigration visit is routine or triggered, that stamina starts to snap. And hers did, slowly, bit by bit, until it was no longer just frustration. It became fear. Jenny reportedly noticed the change in visits. Officials starting to stop by more, paperwork taking longer, staff treating her a little cooler, nothing explosive but icy. And consistent. The kind of coolness that starts to feel systemic. It wasn't paranoia, it was accumulation. She started keeping notes. Dates, people, tone of voice. Because when you're not sure who's behind something, you start questioning everything. Every delay in your residency process feels like sabotage. Every knock at the door feels like a warning. You're no longer a wife. You're a case. There were still cameras around sometimes. They captured the surface drama, crying, pleading, tension. But not the hollow dread quietly eating her up between scenes. What audience ever sees the woman who lies awake wondering if she'll be escorted out of the country she moved to for love? Not deported for a crime, but because someone didn't like what she represented. And this wasn't post-breakup damage control. Jenny was very much still in the marriage, still in the house, still trying, still loving a man she believed had once fought for her, until she realized something cruel. She might be the only one still swinging. Off camera, Jenny began breaking down regularly. Friends say she would call home crying, desperate for clarity. Why weren't things calming down? Why would neighbors who barely knew her be filing complaints? Why would people mention her name like a problem, not a person? Emotionally, she was at war, and she was the only soldier on her side. It's easy to blame the foreign wife trope. Easy to roll eyes, say she should have known what she was getting into. But how many people walk into a marriage expecting to defend their existence in front of authorities? Jenny's hardest battles weren't with in-laws. It was with invisible consequences slowly being positioned against her through back channels she couldn't control or access. And then came her shift. She stopped crying to be loved, started asking to be protected. The love story Jenny signed up for became a legal chess match she didn't ask for. When subtle suppression becomes danger, love becomes function. She wanted security, clarity. Legal clarity that she wasn't an undocumented burden or a cultural disgrace. If her in-laws weren't going to support her existence and her husband wouldn't stop them, isn't self-defense the only position left? From what's been told, Jenny brought this to Sumit again. Calm, then emotional, then tough. Her tears weren't pleas. They were warning signs. She was tired of being treated like the fire when she was burning alone. She reportedly told him something that stuck. That love without protection doesn't mean safety. That safety without choice isn't home, it's prison. And Sumit, the man who had once picked her over everything, reportedly froze. Not because he hated her, or didn't care, but because he didn't know how to pick anymore. The same man who snuck around for a decade hiding Jenny from relatives now couldn't hide from the truth. His silence was no longer neutral. It was participation. Jenny allegedly teetered into action. Started researching legal protections, ones that apply internationally when a woman is being indirectly intimidated in a marriage. Not because she wanted to retaliate, but because she knew that without formal movement, she had no real ground. Marriage papers meant nothing if every official visit felt like a countdown. She wasn't threatening. She was preparing. Preparing for the possibility that this relationship could end not through divorce, but displacement. That she'd be forced out via pressure, and the only way to counter that was through legal language back. Because suddenly, the balance was entirely gone. Jenny no longer saw this as a dysfunctional family. She saw it as a situation where her mental peace, legal status, and entire livelihood in India were at stake, and no one inside that home was stopping it. She allegedly made it clear she could take action. Contact legal authorities in the U.S., raise harassment claims internationally, talk to immigration consultants. None of this was secret, and still, no one shut it down. Jenny wasn't bluffing anymore. She was bracing for survival, and that's when everything shifted again. Jenny assumed the moment the word legal entered the conversation, people would back off. That whisper campaigns would cool, and Sumit would finally take a firm side. But according to people close to the situation, that's not what happened. Jenny thought the man who once risked everything to marry her would now risk backlash to defend her. But when authorities started circling back with real decisions, what Jenny didn't expect was who Sumit would defend once the authorities stepped in. When it comes down to it, loyalty isn't just about love, it's about action. And when Sumit was asked to choose between standing beside his wife or protecting his parents from potential legal fallout, he didn't pick Jenny. He pleaded for leniency, for understanding, for the authorities not to punish his parents, despite evidence that they may have been involved in trying to force Jenny out. That single choice, quiet, maybe even compassionate in his own head, was the moment everything broke beyond repair. This wasn't about harsh words anymore. It wasn't about difficult in-laws or awkward dinners. It was about preservation. And when survival instincts kick in, people show you who they really are. Jenny felt it hit her instantly. Not like an argument or a betrayal you can scream about. This one was colder. He didn't yell. He didn't leave. He just didn't fight for her. Not when it counted. Not when it scared her. Not when it could have changed the entire outcome. That's not something marriages come back from. Sumit's choice wasn't just about protecting his parents from jail or paperwork. It was, on some level, about keeping his identity intact. In Indian family culture, loyalty to parents is often sacred. Filial duty is not a preference, it's your legacy. But in a marriage, the emotional and moral weight shifts. That's why it's called a union. And in Jenny's eyes, Sumit failed to merge paths. He split. He didn't throw her out. He didn't file against her. He didn't do anything extreme. That's what made it harder. He simply took no position when she begged for clarity and protection, and then finally stepped forward for someone else. People watching might say he was trying to de-escalate, trying to calm everything down, maybe even trying to avoid having his parents locked up over actions he didn't condone. But intentions don't insulate consequences. And the consequence was that the woman who left her entire country, family, and comfort to be with him now realized she was alone, emotionally, legally, and physically, in a country actively pushing her out. That realization doesn't happen during a fight. It happens in silence, in the empty space after the authorities leave. When Jenny is sitting alone, wondering how many more doors are going to close and what Sumit's silence cost her this time. People close to the family noticed the shift too. Jenny stopped trying to bridge anything. Her expressions changed. The hope drained out of her conversations. Open doors turned shut one by one, not slammed, not noisy, quietly, emotionally, permanently. And all of this starts to make sense when you connect it to the people constantly calling what they had an embarrassment. The alleged whisper campaign from neighbors didn't stop after the wedding. If anything, marriage made it louder. They didn't see a wedding. They saw defiance. An insult to custom, abuse of tradition. Not a young man choosing love, but a grown son mocking elders by choosing a woman older than his own mother. In their minds, Sumit didn't just disobey, he brought shame to their street. So, when the story behind closed doors shifted from emotion to strategy, their complaints allegedly became more specific. Not just age or culture. She's creating a disturbance. She doesn't respect our norms. This isn't safe. And then, according to sources, came the paper trail. Reports suggest that written complaints from multiple community members were being casually curated, perhaps even coached, to build a perception of Jenny as not just an outsider, but a threat to balance. Behavioral concerns, mental health red flags, words that carry extra weight in a bureaucratic space. Even one unverified letter of concern can trigger an internal review. Jenny, understandably, spiraled. She allegedly still hadn't filed anything formal on her own. But emotionally, she knew the walls were closing in, that she had walked into a family feud that no longer understood where the line was. And here's where things get financial. Behind the psychological breakdown and the emotional divide was something worse: alleged monetary damages. Sumit's family didn't want a scandal, but they may have accidentally created one. Because now, there were numbers being whispered. Claims of upwards of $250,000 in potential damages connected to emotional distress, legal consultations, possibly even civil filings floating behind the scenes. The public didn't hear about this. No formal court case aired. No big media press conference. But according to people on both adjacent sides, money became part of the conversation. Jenny, pushed this far, allegedly considered civil action, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because when you live in a place without roots, and someone's leveraging the earth beneath you to weaken your stance, money becomes the only language anybody respects. Legal pressure isn't about winning. It's about making people think twice before they try to erase you casually. Sumit, reportedly overwhelmed, didn't handle this wave. He dodged, delayed, pleaded neutral. He didn't scream, he smoothed. Tried to run out the clock on confrontation. But all that did was delay the collapse. Jenny wasn't asking for a war. She was asking for defense. She didn't want someone to attack his family. She wanted someone to admit they were wrong. To say they wouldn't try to get her kicked out of a country she married into. He didn't say that. And as soon as he chose calm over confrontation, Jenny started choosing distance over peace. Because at that point, what was she staying for? A man who loved her, maybe, but couldn't fight for her. Culture is not an excuse for abandonment. She was never asking Sumit to hate his parents. She was asking him to draw a boundary that protected her from what even local officials were starting to take seriously. Love didn't fail them. Courage did. And when one person stands unprotected too long, love stops being a shelter and starts being a sentence. The world says you should forgive people caught between family and love. But how much forgiveness is left when you're still the one at risk? Jenny had been patient long before there were legal whispers, long before the documents, long before the neighbors turned from nosy to dangerous. She waited through betrayals the audience never saw. But holding out for someone to finally act right isn't loyalty. It's emotional debt. And her balance was empty. What started as a reality TV risk became a legal chessboard of humiliation, silence, and betrayal. And now Jenny has a decision that could end the marriage or end her time in India, or both sometimes. The worst breakups don't involve shouting. They involve silence. And for Jenny, that silence didn't just creep in after an argument. It arrived because everything she thought she'd built started cracking from the inside out. Not on camera, not in a viral moment, but in quiet evenings where no one would talk to her, no one would explain what was happening, and no one was truly on her side. She was still legally married, still in the same house, still being included in family scenes when needed. But emotionally, she was invisible. Everything she used to depend on, her marriage, her husband, her hope, started to feel like it had been hollowed out. Like she was standing in a place with walls and furniture, but no warmth, and no exit plan. People think heartbreak is dramatic, but this wasn't just heartbreak. This was emotional displacement. This was waking up unsure day after day whether the country you now live in is actively trying to remove you, wondering who's been contacted, who's been spoken to, who's quietly working to unseat you from an entire life you sacrificed everything to create. Insiders close to her say Jenny stopped sleeping normally, reportedly staying up all night scrolling, researching residency requirements and immigration gray areas, trying to figure out how long she'd be allowed to stay without trouble, what alternatives existed, whether she'd need a lawyer, how fast things could change. She wasn't preparing for a divorce. She was preparing for erasure. That kind of paranoia isn't delusion. It's trauma layered with bureaucracy, and her world got smaller. Fewer calls, fewer videos, no casual Instagram updates, no look at this cute chai moment content. Jenny vanished online, piece by piece. And for someone already isolated linguistically and geographically, that drop-off felt weightier than anything she posted. Her absence said more than any quote she could have shared. When you feel unsupported in private and silenced in public, your mind starts to fill in the gaps. Not because you want drama, but because you feel like you're the only one still operating in truth, while the people around you are handling the situation like a PR challenge. What people forget is that Jenny wasn't just a partner in a marriage. She was a legal resident dependent on that marriage. One wrong move, one unchecked complaint, and her position in India could be revoked or endlessly delayed. And the psychological pressure of operating under that kind of weight is massive, especially when you know the people closest to you could stop it, and haven't. Legal experts who have worked with expat marriages say this part is common: the emotional fallout before any official action. There's a long trail of expat spouses, mostly women, who arrive through love and stay on thin bureaucratic ground, completely unprepared for how easily the system can turn on them. And once the family they married into withdraws support, their visa becomes a legal limbo. There are publicly documented cases across India, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, where women married into foreign homes suddenly faced silence, legal confusion, rejection from communities and family sponsors, and ultimately removal. Not by force, but by delay, by allegation, by quiet system resistance. That's the part that hurts the most. You're not even being actively kicked out. You're just erased from all layers of safety until you choose to leave yourself. And that seemed to be exactly Jenny's corner. Friends say she wasn't eating well, not always answering texts. Emotional withdrawal followed by random bursts of defiant clarity. She'd threaten legal action, then drop it. She'd say she was ready to leave, then stay quiet for days. This was the stage where you're too restless to keep pretending but too shattered to walk out. She used to beg for connection with Sumit, with his family, with India as home. But begging turns into rage when you realize you were never supposed to win. And that's when she went quiet, not cold, but clear. Not every breakdown happens with cameras in the room. Sometimes it happens in the shower, or under a thin ceiling fan, where you hear the neighbors go about their lives unaware you feel hunted, where familiar walls feel unfamiliar. Like the country, the language, the customs, the system, all of it is watching you fail on purpose. By all accounts, Jenny was now functioning on instincts, not dreams, not plans, just survival. What made it worse was the fact that no one seemed to publicly recognize the shift. There was no outpouring of support, no institutional reassurance, no viral clip of Sumit holding her hand and saying, "I've got this." All she got was silence. The silence you receive when everyone else's loyalty has already been reassigned. But while Jenny was dealing with the emotional collapse, there's another story that allegedly quietly unfolded behind the scenes, the financial one. Because alongside the collapse of intimacy came the cold outlines of legal language. And somewhere in that collapse, there was allegedly a growing conversation not about protection, but about a lawsuit. Word got around, reports not publicly filed but echoed within certain circles, that a civil case was being explored. Emotional damages, legal costs, breach of security, possibly upwards of $250,000. Not fantasy numbers. Actual consequences for what Jenny might have suffered and what it could legally mean. But while everyone focused on Jenny's anxiety, a civil case was allegedly growing in the background, one worth more than $250,000. When people hear the word lawsuit, they think of headlines, courtrooms, explosions of drama. But what they don't see is how slowly it starts. A string of emails, a single consultation, a draft that sits in a private folder for weeks before it even sees a desk. And in Jenny's case, that silence became the loudest confirmation yet of just how far things had fallen. The alleged civil dispute surrounding Jenny wasn't about one fight or one document or one bad week. It was about buildup. Layer after layer of pressure, silence, and harm, emotional, verbal, psychological stacking until it became weight. The kind of weight that costs money, time, stability, and maybe, most devastatingly, peace of mind. Sources connected to the couple claim that legal relief was very much on the table. Not a bluff, not a threat. A real strategy, not to punish out of spite, but to get back some version of control. Because when everything else, from your home to your residency, is unstable, the legal system becomes your only backup plan. And $250,000, that wasn't some exaggerated celebrity number. That figure allegedly represented a mix of damages, emotional distress, therapy and medical costs, lawyer consultations, potential housing relocation, and projected income loss due to instability that Jenny hadn't caused, but was forced to live in. Even if the case never reached court, the pressure of it was real, and it was spreading. The emotional damage alone was quantifiable. Prolonged fear, repeat panic, constant anxiety about deportation, reputational fallout, being cast as a problem in a community that once barely knew her name. Jenny didn't just lose sleep. She allegedly lost work opportunities, social access, and the emotional foundation she had once walked into this marriage believing she could build. And while she was calculating damages, something else was stacking: the immigration pressure. According to those close to Jenny, strange timing and procedural hiccups became the new normal. Appointments rescheduled, requests suddenly more aggressive, officials showing up more frequently than they ever had before. Individually, nothing seemed outrageous, but together it looked like a setup. Legal consultants not officially tied to the case have described scenarios like this before. They often play out in situations where a family withdraws silent cooperation, even without filing anything formally. The sponsored spouse, usually a woman, begins to notice that officials treat them differently, more like a policy inconvenience than a person. And while nothing is revoked outright, everything becomes harder to maintain. For Jenny, this meant walking on eggshells. Everything she did felt like it could be used against her. Her tone, her words, her presence. She wasn't fighting for love anymore. She was fighting for legal footing. And that's a kind of stress people vastly underestimate. Forget the romance, this was survival, and it was taking her apart. By now, her relationship with Sumit had deteriorated into something unrecognizable. Not enemies, not lovers. Strangers with overlapping history. The kind of standoff where he said little, did less, and she stopped expecting anything at all. Trust, gone, completely, painfully gone. Every day Jenny was left to exist in silence. Her belief that this marriage had been real crumbled a little more. What had been framed as a courageous choice, choosing love over culture, now felt like voluntary vulnerability. like she had handed someone her life and watched them do nothing while it was attacked, piece by piece. And meanwhile, the tension around the alleged civil dispute kept building. It wasn't about revenge. It was about proof that she hadn't hallucinated the pressure, that the community didn't just turn on her out of coincidence, that this didn't happen because she was too sensitive or not adjusting. Jenny wanted to show that damage had occurred, and not only was it avoidable, it had been orchestrated under the radar of legality until she spoke up. Legally, the presence of written complaints, questionable documentation, and changed behavior from officials might be enough to raise alarms, even if nothing criminal had been committed, which made this an expensive standoff. And in that silence, both sides reportedly agreed on one thing: don't speak to media, don't post online, don't give statements, because statements become evidence. And no one at that point wanted to risk losing negotiation power. So the public saw nothing. They saw no dramatic scandal, no apology post, no big walkout. But behind the scenes, everybody was operating with lawyers or legal guidance. They weren't reconciling. They were protecting assets, rights, future claims. The worst kind of breakdown isn't loud, it's methodical. And that's exactly what this became: a calm hell. Even extended family grew quiet. People who had once played peacemakers kept their heads down. Neighbors who once gave snide glances said nothing at all. The chill had settled into every layer of this story. Emotionally, Jenny collapsed in stages. She no longer expected comfort. She reportedly stopped believing in fairness. And most painfully, she stopped expecting anything from Sumit, not because of hate, but because she couldn't afford to keep hoping. You reach a point where begging becomes embarrassing, where defending yourself from people who claim to love you begins to feel like an injury with no end. And for Jenny, that point arrived at the worst emotional time, which is when you're already unstable and still not allowed to leave without consequences. Because even walking away meant losing more, giving up her new identity, backing out of the country she tried so hard to adopt, admitting that she hadn't won anything, she'd survived something. Barely. People watching from outside couldn't see this unraveling. Because when the silence is strategic, destruction leaves fewer traces. And for Sumit, his image, carefully maintained as caught in the middle, didn't age well under pressure. What looked like passivity at first began to take on the shape of complicity. Because when you're the only one unaffected, and the person you claim to love is falling apart beside you, silence is no longer neutral. And there was still no closure. No arrest. No deportation. But no peace either. Legal gray zone. Emotional injuries. And a marriage gasping for meaning in the middle of all of it. What started as a highly watched reality romance had deflated into a paper trail of complaints, escalations, and pain. People who have handled similar cases say this is one of the coldest ways for love to die, not with fire, but with paperwork. A quiet bureaucracy of hurt, where no one says goodbye and no one wins, but the damage stays anyway. And yet, in the face of all this destruction, what's really shocking is the one thing that might have been avoided if one decision had changed. There comes a point in every collapsing relationship where love stops being the question. Where do you love me? Is replaced with something quieter, more urgent, and more impossible to ignore. Am I safe with you? That's what Jenny was left with. Love didn't matter anymore because even people who love you can become unpredictable, indifferent, or quietly dangerous when they feel torn. And emotionally, Jenny wasn't just being let down. She was feeling dismissed in a setting where the consequences weren't just feelings. They were legal, they were social, and they were stacked against her from every direction. This wasn't about a breakup. This was about trying to survive inside something that still wore the mask of marriage, next to a man who still claimed loyalty, but without any of the protections, reassurances, or commitment that loyalty's supposed to carry. According to those closest to the situation, Jenny's world shrank. She didn't just withdraw from public life. She reportedly withdrew from basic conversations, stopped attending any family-related events, became cautious about even walking through certain parts of the neighborhood. Not because of fear in the traditional sense, but because of where. You don't yell when you're already exhausted. You avoid, you shrink, you vanish, emotionally first, then physically. And meanwhile, headlines still called it a marriage. But what exactly was left to call it that? She had no support system in the country. Her legal protection allegedly grew thinner by the week. Her communication with Sumit's parents was, by every account, fully severed. And there were no signs of reconciliation. No calls, no efforts, nothing. In the end, they didn't just reject her, they allegedly tried to erase her with systems, not words. Cultural compromise can survive a lot: bad cooking, language barriers, even harsh relatives. But psychological withdrawal in the face of pressure that can ruin your home, your name, and your status in a foreign country. That breaks something permanent. Jenny wasn't weak. She had traveled halfway across the world multiple times, waded through lies, learned how to live in someone else's shadows just to love them. But love with no shelter eventually feels like drowning in someone else's comfort zone. And Sumit, the guy who started out as the soft-spoken romantic willing to defy centuries for her, what was left of him? Was he suffering silently, torn apart between duty and guilt? Or had he just adjusted, learned how to compartmentalize it all while telling himself Jenny would be okay eventually? To the outside world, silence looks like peace. But inside relationships, silence is often the crime. The real question Jenny had to live through wasn't whether she was right or wrong. It was whether love is still love when the person next to you won't help you stand. And for many watching closely, Sumit's passivity began to look less like emotional paralysis and more like a failure of character. Because when someone watches you drown and merely worries you'll splash too loudly, that isn't confusion. That's neglect. And if you flip the roles here, the questions get darker. If Jenny had been a younger Indian woman, married into an American household where her in-laws were spreading complaints about her to the local community, calling her unstable, potentially fabricating community signatures to create disturbance cases, while local authorities began quietly surveilling her movements, would we be asking if she was overreacting? Would there be sympathy? Would we minimize her intuition as insecurity? Or would we call it exactly what it is? Now switch one more piece. If Sumit were the one being isolated, feeling powerless in a foreign system with no backup, while his partner pulled disappearing acts whenever the heat rose, would people be saying, well, he knew what he signed up for? Probably not, because there's a type of emotional cruelty that gets missed when it isn't loud, when it looks like patience or avoidance. It's when your well-being is slowly sacrificed to keep things calm, to avoid uncomfortable conversations, to protect someone else's image with your silence. And Jenny's silence for a while benefited everyone but her. Online, people speculated. Some assumed the couple had finally cracked and separated. Others thought maybe it was just a rough patch. But on the ground, the emotional split had already happened. Maybe not on paper, maybe not in court, but her marriage as a safe place, a chosen family, or a human alignment had dissolved. All that was left was the paperwork, which, ironically, may have been the only thing keeping her in the country. This is what happens when toxicity isn't explosive. It festers instead, through cold legal routes, through passive disinterest, through coordinated social pressure with no public name attached. No fists, no screaming matches, just isolation with a wedding certificate. And that's the most dangerous part of these marriage stories caught between cultures, customs, and cameras. The same audience that claps for unconventional love stories rarely stays to read the legal disclaimers at the end. But the patterns here, they aren't isolated. Across multiple countries, there's growing awareness of foreign spouses, especially women, being systematically pushed out or shut down after being welcomed in, romantically, with full enthusiasm until they start asking for equal footing. It starts with asking to be included, then asking to be defended, then realizing that asking gets you marked as inconvenient. From there, the pattern repeats. The icy in-laws, the legal threats that can't be traced, the neighborhood complaints, and eventually an official document that makes it all formal. That's not a breakup. That's erasure disguised as reconciliation. And it raises a hard question. In modern global marriages, how much safety does the non-local partner really have once the romance is replaced by politics, pressure, and perception? Because if the only thing holding your life together is someone else's willingness to speak up, and they refuse to, what's left? Maybe nothing, or maybe a suitcase. And that brings us back to loyalty. Who defines what loyalty is? Protecting your elders or your partner? Staying quiet for the sake of appearances, or exposing the cracks before they become wounds? Because when loyalty becomes a tool for emotional violence, when it's used to excuse silence, deny protection, and justify inaction, what justice system is equipped to untangle that? Who gets to say what was cultural preservation and what was slow destruction? And what happens when your marriage turns into the most polite version of imprisonment, one that doesn't leave scars on your body but bruises everything else? Maybe we'll never get answers to all of that. Maybe Jenny won't either. But one thing is clear. Love can survive opposition and distance and hardship. But it cannot survive when the only person protecting you in a foreign home decides your protection is optional. Sumit's loyalty to his parents isn't evil. But it was not enough. Not when the emotional costs were only charged to one person. Not when the legal system was allegedly used as a threat and not a safeguard. And this isn't about Jenny staying or going. It's about the unspeakable in-between that so many people, trapped in similar cross-national, culturally divided unions, silently carry every single day. It's a warning about what happens when institutions refuse to recognize that emotional coercion isn't just a marital issue. It's how people lose countries. And if you think this is where their story ends, you're underestimating how far reality TV fallout can echo.